Hello and welcome to the RDS Library Speaker Series. Today I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing over several decades, but particularly about my book, Irish Country Furniture and Furnishings, 1700 to 2000. This is a book which is substantially bigger and enlarged compared to a book I wrote 30 years ago, which was called Irish Country Furniture, 1700 to 1950. So I've been asked to talk about the making of this newly enlarged book. So I'm going to look back at some of the photographs I took 30 years ago for this book and discuss some of the stories behind them. And some of the stories behind the recent work that I've done in the last 4 or 5 years, revising it and updating it. So I'll come to the first slide, which shows a photograph I took in 1989. At this point, I was knocking on doors all over Ireland to try and find authentic furniture in its original surroundings. So this was exactly the sort of farmhouse I was turning up at. And these people, this is a brother and a sister, you can see outside their little farmhouse in a show in the north of County Donegal in the north of Ireland. So I was able to go inside this house, and it was one of the most exciting houses because it still had all its original furniture in it. It was barely modernized, and that was the kind of thing I was looking for. So now I'll go inside and I'll show you what I found inside. This is the kitchen of the woman that you just saw outside. So her dresser, for example, would have been the pride of the kitchen, and we'll look at a few dressers this morning, but this dresser has a totally traditional arrangement of basins on the middle shelf, all upside down, arranged in a completely traditional way. Big meat platters on the top shelf, leant forward onto bars to stop the dust settling on their patterns, and everything else arranged in this very traditional way. This house doesn't have a stainless steel sink. It doesn't have a modern kitchen as we know it today. So the kitchen table was the worktop for everything that was done. Recently revising this work and going back to these much more important pictures now that I look at them 30 years later, it's sort of tragic to think that I couldn't go back into these houses again because they're gone. And this is a reminder, actually. Recently, a friend of mine in Donegal sent me a photograph of this house as it is now. And it's so shocking to see it with the roof fallen in and completely derelict and all the furniture inside gone. So that's a reminder of how important these early pictures were, and how interesting it is to revisit them, a little bit like laying down old wine and finding it's much, much better after a few years. So that's a contrast to the kind of work I've been doing more recently, which is looking in museum collections and finding out what they've got. Since I did that work in the late 1980s and 1990s. So I'm a curator at the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum currently, and I look at objects. And so my first visit there last year in 2019, on my last day, I thought when I was up in Belfast, I just thought I'll take some pictures that might be useful for the book. So this was my typical journey to work, walking along this little grassy boreen and coming across these goats, and in the background you can see a thatched house which I was heading for. I'd already been inside it and I thought this looked like a really lovely photographic shoot. So there's the front of the house with its thatch, with its half door. The Ulster Folk Museum reconstructs all these extraordinary houses exactly as they were before, and this is the Ballyvanemore farmhouse from County Down, from the mountains of Mourne. So inside, they've actually got all the furniture which was appropriate to the house at the time. That the whole house was given to the Ulster Folk Museum, and they were able to reconstruct everything more or less exactly as it used to be. So the dresser is the dresser that was originally in that house. And there it is, and you can see the half door, the red half door on one side, open to let the light in for my photograph. And the dash churn and everything else. It was just wonderful, lovely, beautiful. After a few minutes, the goats followed me up the path and in through the hearth door, and this was not what I'd expected at all, and they immediately began to cause havoc. So I had to shoo them out, and I was reminded then what that half door was for the farmer's wife, it would have separated the wildlife from outside, from the domestic environment inside. So the half door was literally keeping out the livestock, keeping in little children, keeping them separate, and yet allowing light to come in. So that was a really nice reminder, and it was a, typically funny, lovely morning's work. Looking at the ceiling of that farmhouse, I had been struck at how light it was, and it took me a little while to realise why. And that's because the whole of the ceiling, which would have been dark with the underside of the thatch, had been lined underneath with flour bags. Now, flour bags turn out to be something that people commonly recycled. They just gathered them, they scrubbed off all the print, they used them for everything from clothing to aprons to curtains to tablecloths. Everything that you would use textiles for, they recycled their flour bags into. And they even carefully unpicked the thread and used the thread again. So this flour bag ceiling enabled the kitchen to be bright and light and lovely. And when I was working in Cork Public Museum in Cork City, I came across a flour bag that had this extraordinary label on it that says, "To remove this label, soak in water." So the flour companies, the millers, knew that the flour bags were desirable and that they'd be washing off the print. And I thought it was really interesting that they put this message on that told you that the print would wash off beautifully, because of course you didn't want the print on the flour bag at all. So that's interesting, there's a flour bag ceiling in that particular house. And of course, having that white ceiling above the dresser enabled my book designers to choose it for the front cover of my book, which is great actually. So there it is, with its flour bag ceiling sort of blending up into the title. Now, other people had dresses as well, of course, and they were generally the pride of the Irish kitchen. So this is one of the most exciting new photographs that I've managed to incorporate in the new book. And it's a picture of an Irish celebrity called Peg Sayers. Most Irish people who learnt to speak Irish in Irish schools would know who Peg Sayers was. But she was photographed by an American magazine in 1940, and the photographer had her pose in front of the dresser. So here is Peg Sayers standing in front of her dresser, which is terribly interesting to me because she's got all sorts of extraordinary things arranged on it. It was the pride of the kitchen. It was her status symbol. And at this point, well, she lived on the Great Blasket Island on the coast of Kerry. So she had fishing floats, glass fishing floats along the top of the dresser. And I've bought a glass fishing float. I've actually got glass fishing floats along the top of my dresser. They're lovely things. And ever since my childhood in County Cork, we used to collect them, and now they're really not there anymore. So these glass fishing floats were lovely along the top of lots of people's dressers. And the other thing that she had, which is written in the magazine caption, is electric light bulbs. On the far right of that picture, above where I've put the date, there are 3 electric light bulbs. So the Blasket Islanders collected all sorts of things, and electric light bulbs were a curio. There was no electricity on the island, but they put them on show, and they would have been a conversation piece. So Peg Sayers' dresser has got so much interesting stuff, including jam jars, which we now take for granted, but they were precious, they were arranged, they were all polished. So all this lovely glass would have looked lovely amongst her basins and her plates and her loaf of bread, which of course was her produce too. So that's the Blasket Island, which has all sorts of interesting history, but that particular dresser is a really important one for me. Something else from the Blasket Island that turned up very recently, actually during the spring of 2020, during the pandemic, this came to light. This is a deck chair from the shipwreck of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Cork in 1915, and it was a tragedy that there was a loss of 1,198 lives on this luxury liner that was coming from New York across the Atlantic. She was torpedoed by a U-boat, and that action is what brought the Americans into the war. So a lot of people know about the wreck of the Lusitania, but I didn't know about all the flotsam and jetsam that came off the shipwreck, as well as the deaths, of course. So people were looking out not only for bodies, but for objects. And the Blasket Islanders came across this deck chair, which is a six-legged chair. It's made of beech, it has bronze fittings. It would have been a really top-class, beautiful object when it was new. And quite a lot of deck chairs floated in and have ended up in different houses along the Cork coast. Exactly the same design was used on the Titanic. So in New York, there's a deck chair almost identical to this with its footrest, which is missing here from the Titanic. So looking at this as a furniture historian, it's a fascinating object. It's very comfortable, it's made to fold, and to think of it ending up by the fire, by the turf fire in a little cottage on the Blasket Island, and the conversations that must have revolved around its use, because for sure people would have sat on it, is fascinating to me. And it's been painted many times, which is a traditional thing. So it has layers of red and green and blue paint, which makes me imagine that it would have matched the dresser, it would have matched the other things in the kitchen, because usually that was the way that things were done. So this chair is so interesting in many ways. And when the Blasket Islanders were evacuated from that island in 1953, there's a wonderful photograph of four men coming up the slip, and one of them is holding the deck chair folded in one hand. It was so precious, it was taken with them and brought ashore, and now it's in the Blasket Island Centre. Of course, this isn't a typical example of vernacular furniture. This is more typical. These are Sugorn chairs, and I'm very interested in the history of the people who made these things. Vernacular furniture is very often anonymous. So coming across Christy Sullivan, who was a chairmaker who died in 1998, and I used to go and visit him in Kerry repeatedly in his workshop. You can see him here holding two chairs in his hands, and he was the maker of Sugorn chairs. And Sugorn chairs were a traditional type of chair with a homemade seat, made of twisted straw or twisted hay rope. So he's got this twisted straw seat on his Sugorn chair, which he's holding in his right hand. And I brought one with me. He made quite a lot of them. He was a proper vernacular maker. This was poor man's upholstery, really, and you could replace it yourself with your own rope. Subsequently, people used fishing twine for the seats when they stopped using Sugorn. So you can see the chair in the middle with the green seat. That little chair has a fishing twine seat. And then at the extreme right-hand side of the picture, we've got a chair made in the 1970s by Garrett Fitzgerald in Kerry, and he was using recycled teak from teak windows. So when people having a teak windows pulled out and putting PVC windows in instead, he was rescuing the teak and making it into Sugorn chairs. But his, of course, are much higher, they're much more appropriate for us tall people compared to the smaller chairs from the 18th and 19th centuries. So that slide shows just how much smaller chairs were and how much lower people sat next to the open turf fire in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Sugorn chairs can be traced right back in inventories, right back to the 17th century. The word Sugorn chair shows us that continuity. So that's interesting to see that change going on through time. I'm very interested in how frugal Irish householders were with their materials. And when I went back to the museums just to see what had been collected since my first sort of swathe of research in the late 1980s, I was particularly excited to see this little household shrine in amongst the stores in the National Museum in County Mayo. And there were a few shrines there, but I thought, I'll look at this blue and white one because it looks interesting. So I started photographing it, and I set it all up, and I was figuring it all out. And then I turned it around and I looked at the back, and I was amazed to see that the back revealed the fact that it was completely made out of packing cases. So we have accession for this, and it was made by somebody called Frank Weir, who apparently recycled butter boxes and crates and made these little shrines and gave them to members of his family on special occasions. So there's a lot of detail about this, and when we look at the newspaper that he used around the back to seal it up, it tells us that it was made no earlier than 1904. So this little household shrine is really extraordinary in terms of the fact it was made from virtually nothing. It was just recycled and painted crates from Barrington soap, and actually if you read the logo on the back it says "in use unsurpassed," referring to the Dublin soap makers' slogan. Something else which was widely recycled and reused is the butter box. Now, the butter boxes are important, particularly in the south of Ireland, but actually all over Ireland, because Ireland was one of the biggest exporters of butter in the world in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And so butter production was massively important. People were milking and making their own butter, taking their butter to market. And Cork City was one of the several centres for butter grading and export. So these come from the Butter Museum in Cork. And on the far left, you can see the original butter box, which from about 1915, 1920 onwards, we have these mass-produced butter boxes rather than casks. And the butter boxes found their way into people's houses, and then they were recycled brilliantly into all sorts of things, particularly seats and containers. So people used the lid and put upholstery on the lid, then they hinged them and made them into fireside seats, which held sort of fireside objects, I suppose, maybe fuel. And then on the far right, you've got a really lovely example, which is all lined with satin and would have been appropriate for a woman's sewing kit. So you've got all the extremes from the very basic one at one end to the much more beautiful one at the other end, which is, you know, sumptuously lined. And they were really common. And even in the late 1980s, when I started doing my fieldwork, I used to come across these again and again beside the fire. So the butter box is a really good example of a ubiquitous recycled object. Looking also at how people were very frugal with materials, Ireland was very heavily deforested. By the 18th century, poets were lamenting the lack of woodland and the lack of trees. And this was a situation which Ireland is still one of the most deforested nations in Europe. So we come across a lot of objects which were made using as little timber as possible. And also people lived in small spaces. They really lived in tiny cabins. So the falling table is an example of something which, instead of having four legs, it has one leg and it hinges against the wall. And I was really lucky to come across this when I was doing field work in County Kilkenny, to come across the falling table still in situ. They were quite rare even in 1987. So this red thing hinged up against the wall is called a falling table. And there it is, hinged down with its yellow top, hinged down for use as a table with the form next to it. And actually with the cat in the foreground, who I don't know normally show that cat, but he caused so much trouble for me that day, that tomcat, that I thought I'd include him today. It was a very, very interesting day of photography, although having my camera bag sprayed by the tomcat was a disadvantage when I got home later that night. And the elderly brother and sister who kindly allowed me into their house in Kilkenny, there you can see them, Nell and Ned Leahy, and me holding the cat to stop it causing trouble. So there are very few pictures of me at work, but that's one of them. And so it was fantastic to find the falling table there. Falling tables were found all over Ireland. In every county of Ireland, they were a thing. You can trace them back through inventories right back to the 17th century, and they have lots of different names. The falling leaf table, the drop table, but they just did save space and save timber all at once. Nell and Ned Leahy had all sorts of other interesting things as well, and Nell liked to paint things repeatedly. So it's very interesting to see that she had two gypsy tables. As the name suggests, gypsy tables would have been made by people traveling around. They'd have been made at the side of the road using packing cases for the tops. They've commonly got this three-legged construction with natural branches, and she'd painted them green. Quite delicate and lovely, I photographed them outside in her garden, as you can see. So I was quite surprised when I went to the National Museum 2 years ago, and I found there was Nell's gypsy table, long after her having passed away, collected into the collection of the National Museum. So it's the very same one. I'll just go back so you can see. The one on the right where the triangle is close to the ground is the one that the National Museum have acquired. And of course, antique dealers took my book, they knocked on doors, they tried to track things down, and they did track things down successfully and then sell them to the museum. So that's, I suppose it's a good thing in the long term that they did that, because these have now been rescued. Two more gypsy tables here. The central one is really interesting because it's completely made with cotton reels. The four legs are covered in wooden cotton reels that have been carefully graduated, which is great. And then the one on the right is a more elaborate version. Just to remind you, yes, in the center of that dresser is a particular sort of a crock, which is one which I studied actually when I had a bursary here at the RDS in the Library and Archives. I studied these crocs, which were supported by the Dublin Society. The potteries were supported with prizes and grants from the Dublin Society, and this was the kind of Irish production which was being made. So we have the black crocs and we have the coloured crocs, and the coloured crocs, I've brought one in. They went on being produced right up to the 1930s, and they probably started being produced in places like Coal Island, County Tyrone, in the 17th century. So this is a trailed slip crock, and it would have been used typically for many things in the kitchen. The housewife maybe would have one, so she'd use it for washing her hands, washing her vegetables. She might have another one that she used for setting the cream before she was churning butter. So these are called setting pans or panchions. And I think they're really lovely, really decorative, and you can imagine them being treasured. And Coal Island, County Tyrone, was one of the centres of production because, as the name suggests, they had coal for firing the kilns, and they had the right kind of clay, which was crucial that those two things would be in the same place. Now, the settle bed is another example of people saving space and timber. People didn't really have enough space for extra bedrooms. So the settle bed was typically close to the hearth, which is what you can see here in this house in County Offaly. And by day it was a bench, and then I'll show you how it opens out to become a floor-level, high-sided double bed by night, which contained its own bedding. So it was immensely popular for many people who lived in very tiny houses. It's quite rare to find this sort of thing still in its original house. And this is really an exceptional house indeed. So this is the settle bed. I'll just fold it up again for you. There you can see it folded up with its straw mattress inside typically, and its feather tick and its bedding, and then opened down at night. So it more or less formed a bedroom in its own right. And that was found again in every single county of Ireland. We have settle beds. Quite recently, I came across this one from County Kerry, which is a very decorative one. It has stencils decorating the back panels. It's got a very high seat, which meant that when it was folded out onto the floor, it was a big, wide bed. Stencil decoration is incredibly rare, and I have just included a photograph of this stenciling before it was restored by its owner. So that kind of stencil decoration is probably hidden under a lot of painted furniture's many layers. And I hope this will be in a museum before too long. So that's a County Kerry settle bed. Now, other forms of bed which fold up is this brilliant one from the Irish Agricultural Museum, which is a chest of drawers bed. It's actually called a fold-away bed. So there you can see it on the left, disguised perfectly as a chest of drawers with full straws, and knobs and everything, and then the whole of the front folds right up in the air and is propped up on sticks to create a fold-out bed. So these fold-out beds were really popular in houses that might have a room that doubled as a parlour sometimes, but also obviously needed to cope with the overflow of many people in a big family. So the chest of drawers bed is a rare thing that I'd read about, but I've only just come across it for the first time in the Irish Agricultural Museum in County Wexford last year. So that's a fantastic addition to the repertoire of furniture that we only knew about through texts before. Now, other people improvised by not having very much furniture, and here's a really good photograph that cropped up quite recently from 1915 by a photographer called Cutler, and it shows how people ate out of a basket. So a basket would be used to put boiled potatoes in. People would then gather around it, as they do here. They put it on top of the cooking pot to bring it up to a good height, and everybody would eat the potatoes with their fingers directly from the basket. So this is a great photograph, a very rare photograph actually of this happening, and it's from Galway. Now, the noggin is an object which I did a lot of research into. It's a very complex object, and when you're eating your potatoes from your basket, you might have a noggin in the centre of the basket full of buttermilk. buttermilk was the byproduct of the butter making process. So you'd use buttermilk and you'd dip your potatoes into it, and the noggin would be the thing that would be the centerpiece. So noggins were made by various different people. The wood turner would make the one on the left that's a simple shape. The cooper would make the central one with its metal bands. You have a reproduction coopered noggin here, which is quite robust. It's quite heavy, and it would withstand quite a lot of rough use, I suppose. It would have been expensive. And then there was somebody called the noggin weaver who specialized in another type with its lovely little hidden woven wooden bands, which you can see in the big picture. So it's amazing really to think of these things which don't involve glue, they don't involve metal or screws or nails. They were completely made of wood, and then the band tightened up the staves inside to create something that was watertight. You could drink out of it, you could put your buttermilk in it, or you could use it as a scoop for flour. It was ubiquitous, it was used for everything. And they always have this little slant on the top of the handle so that it can be rested upside down after it's been scoured and scrubbed and cleaned, and then it can be air dried. So the noggin is a lot more complicated than it looks, and the noggin weaver who made that was an impressive craftsperson indeed. The other thing that was resourceful was the use of cow horn to make all sorts of things. And I better just remind you of the kind of horns that cows had at that point. These are spoons. And this is a cow which actually, there's a photograph of this engraving of this cow turns up from the Statistical Survey of County Meath from 1802, which is a publication that was largely underpinned by the Dublin Society, not quite the Royal Dublin Society at that stage. So this shows a prize-winning cow whose name was Strawberry, which is quite touching, actually. I think it's a measure of the affection people had for their animals at that time. But you can see Strawberry's got these amazing big horns, which up until about the 1940s and 50s, cows were allowed to have. So the horns were cut off after slaughter. They were processed by the horner, who was a specialist craftsperson, laboriously processed with about 7 different stages of soaking and boiling and scraping and moulding and heating, and eventually these lovely spoons were the result. Now, spoons of wood were more difficult to wash up, as you can imagine. Those of you who've tried to wash up a porridge spoon know it's quite difficult to get it smooth. So horn spoons are lovely and smooth on the lips. They were used for eating, they were used for scoops. They couldn't be used for stirring hot food because then they became soft again. It's interesting to think of the horner. Probably often he worked around the abattoirs where his material was plentiful. Here's a piece of horn which has been carefully scraped all over, scraped inside. It's completely smooth. This is several stages down the line from the piece of horn that originally would have come off the cow, which was then soaked in barrels for several days. So it was a stinking trade, and we discovered they had a long knife with a cranked end that would be used to scrape out the inside. Then it would be simmered in water for a while to soften it enough to create the bowl of the spoon. So this is a spoon which has, the black tip. The end of the horn is usually black, and then it changes colour. So this part, which has been made into the bowl, has been moulded after simmering in water for a couple of hours. It's then quickly moulded, and there were special little clamps, and then polished. And they used rough salt for polishing them, and it's beautifully transparent. They're wonderful things, smooth on the lips, particularly good for eating eggs with because they didn't impart any taste. And then this one with its lovely flecks is again, this is got a fiddle pattern. I bought a silver spoon, and the two compare. The outline is called fiddle in silver, and some of them have a rat tail on the back, which is what the silver has. I don't have a rat-tailed one, but I've come across them in museums. So it's amazing to think they wanted that very, very fashionable detail on something as as inexpensive, comparatively inexpensive as a horn spoon. They weren't that durable. People had to be careful of them. And they displayed them in dressers. They put them in a little slot at eye level in the shelf so that they could be on display and out of the way of rats or mice or cats or dogs that would eat them if they were left on the floor because they're made of pure protein. And then this is an 18th century one, which is very much copying a pattern of 18th century silver. It's really lovely, very transparent, and it has engraved patterning just on the end of the handle. So, and then we know from museum records that some of them, a clever horner could cut a whistle into the end of the spoon. So this one has a whistle in it. And it's interesting to think that possibly a child in a big family would use this as a toy, but might also whistle to his mother for some more stir-about or some more porridge, if he wanted to. That would have been a really good extra sales ploy, you imagine, in the market. Come on, Mum, buy the one with the whistle. So the horn spoons are an amazing touchstone to people wanting to be fashionable, people wanting something comfortable in their mouths as they ate, and the horner being such a clever craftsperson to produce something that the material costs so little. Really, really interesting. And all sorts of other things are made from horn as well. I'm now going to show you an object called a god in a bottle that very few people can remember or can discuss in any detail. I came across these when I was looking at the things that travelling people would sell door to door. Very few of them survive even in museums. And a god in a bottle is a bit like a ship in a bottle. It's made by somebody clever enough to put a whole lot of tiny things into a bottle. And typically, they were filled with water, like the ones you can see on the screen. And this was considered to be holy water. And if you were lucky enough, when you opened the door to a peddler or a huckster, or they had lots of different names, these people who came door to door selling things, that person might have a god in a bottle, and I'm sure it was something that you would aspire to owning. So this particular one that I have here doesn't have any water in it, but it has all the symbols of Christ's passion, and that was what was desirable. So typically they have the cross in the middle, there's a ladder, spears, sometimes a cockerel, all the different things that were symbolic of Christ's passion. And the four on the screen come from Beamish Open Air Museum in Durham, and they, some of them have, one of them I think has a saw and various other things and a label saying that these were made by the people who made the Dorling and Kindersley Railway. So it can be dated to the 1880s, the third one along. So sometimes they put their own tools in the bottles as well. They were like a sort of talisman. And there's very little written evidence about them, but there's some quite nice folklore manuscripts that talk about one particular traveller who used to visit a village somewhere, I think in Mayo, and his name was, he was called, nicknamed God in the Bottle. So they'd say, oh, here comes God in the Bottle. And he was also spotted going to the village pump, filling up the bottle before he came to the door to sell it to you, purportedly full of holy water. So that's kind of interesting that his name goes into folklore with these extraordinarily rare objects, wonderful objects, which presumably would have made a lovely part of your dresser display. Coming back to my fieldwork in the late 1980s, there's various objects which are incredibly rare outside museums, and the meal chest is a really sort of medieval object, if you like. You would store up your oatmeal and your flour, and you'd try and keep it from the end of the harvest right through to the next year, and you'd pack it tightly into your meal chest, which is what you can see by the fire here in this picture from County Cavan that I took in 1988. When I knocked on the door of this house, I really didn't expect to see this, so it was exciting for me, and it was the only house that I found a meal chest still being used in. First edition of my book doesn't have many people in it, but I've kind of got more interested in the people who enable me to do that work. So I'm going to publish this picture now, which shows the owner of the meal chest making bread over the fire. And Bastable bread, as it was called, is bread that's made in a hanging oven above the turf fire. And you have to know the temperature of your fire very, very well. You put your dough into the Bastable, you put the lid on it, and then you put hot glowing turfs on top of the lid. And you can just see that in the red circle. The turf is on the lid. And when I knocked on the door, that was what was being cooked. It was just extraordinary to see that. It was amazing. And, we were able to taste the bread at the end of the process, which tasted smoky, and it tasted a little bit of goat's milk because she'd used goat's milk. in the mix. So there she is making bastable bread unself-consciously in this house over the turf fire. You can just see her left hand pulling it away from the fire using the crane, this big metal crane as it was called, that all the different kettles and cooking implements were hung on. Quite a sophisticated bit of equipment really, because it enabled you to pull it away from the heat of the fire and put it back on. And so there she is making bastable bread, and the meal chest next to the fire in the traditional place would have been where the meal was kept. Small farmers, the very smallest farms, were much more likely to keep large flocks of poultry than the big farmers who would have devoted their land to keeping cows. So I got very interested in this poultry rearing thing, particularly when I discovered that the coop, the hen coop, which is a piece of kitchen equipment, enabled people to keep their hens laying right through the winter. Those of you who keep hens, and we do keep 6 hens at the minute in our garden in County Cork, will know that usually they don't lay very much in the winter. They become pretty dormant naturally. So if you had a coop in the kitchen where it was warm and light and they'd be kept dry and they'd be fed, you could encourage a flow of eggs right through the winter, which is a very important part of your domestic economy. And the farmer's wife was traditionally very much in touch with her hens. This photograph, this black and white archive photograph, was taken by somebody called Kevin Danaher in about 1950. It's not a museum photograph at all, but you can see this big flock of hens in the foreground. And then on the right, you can see a 2-tier coop from Bunratty Folk Park inside the door of a reconstructed farmhouse. And sometimes the dresser had a display of plates and a coop underneath, which is an amazing combination of very functional in the bottom and this beautiful aesthetic display above. So the hen coop is something that's always fascinated me, and they're very rare, very fascinating objects. And it's interesting to think that during the day they'd be shooed out and they'd be let out and then they'd be brought in again, safe from the foxes and the hawks, and put back in the coop at night. And some farmers' wives would know, they would know when the hen had laid the cherished egg, as it was called, and she wouldn't be let out of the coop and let outside again until she'd laid her egg in the coop. So I thought that was an amazing reflection of how well she knew her fowl. This shows 2 dressers in a house that I knocked on the door of in County Donegal again. And when I first went in there, it's so neat and so beautiful. I said, do you mind if I come back with my cameras and take some pictures the next day? So I was told, yes, of course. And when I walked in the next day, this woman, Connie Henderson, I said, where can I plug in my lights? She said, I don't have any electricity. I hadn't even noticed there was no electricity. In fact, there's a gas light at the top of the picture there. So she had just gas light, and her husband wouldn't have any electricity in the house, apparently, so that's why they never got it. But her husband made the dresser on the left with the glass doors, and her father-in-law made the older dresser, which she's standing with her back to there. So it's very interesting to see the open-fronted, older style of dresser, which was typical up to the end of the 19th century. And then by the beginning of the 20th century, people aspired to glass and plywood and a much more hygienic, easier to keep clean display, where they didn't have to be dusting everything all the time. So it was really fascinating to be able to go into a house like this. I'm pretty sure the house is in ruins now. I felt really privileged to be able to discuss with her that kind of arrangement. And I photographed all the rest of the house as well, and actually found other dresses made by the same people in that locality. They have a very particular sort of signature style. Dresses are a little bit like handwriting. When you begin to notice how they're made, you can see, even though they're not signed, another dresser by the same maker is clearly the same. So that's interesting too. So there were quite a few by her father-in-law, David Henderson, I think his name was, in that locale. And finally, I'd like to thank all the people in the museums that allowed me to photograph their furniture, and all the anonymous owners of people's houses where I was allowed to go in. This last picture shows me looking over the half door in about 1988 with somebody called Seamus Kerwin, who was extraordinary because he lived without any running water, he lived without any electricity. That was the way he lived, quite simply. in a house called Mayglass in County Wexford, which actually after his death was completely restored by the Office of Public Works. So it became a kind of an experiment in investigating the type of house with an earth floor, with thatch, with a great treasure trove of interesting things inside. I hope very much that you've enjoyed having a glimpse of some of the pictures that I've taken over the years. I hope it's helped enhance your appreciation of some of our Irish heritage, which I do think is really extraordinary. And I also think the sustainability which comes out through this frugality is so poignant today. It's so relevant today. We're all thinking about how we can be saving things and using them more carefully. And there we have the pattern for it in our own history. So thank you very much.